Everybody, perfect timing on that note. We'll begin class. Hello, everybody. Welcome to class today. Today, we're going to learn all about national elections. My name is Curry Sotner, and I'm here with our top scholar at the National Constitution Center, Tom Donnelly. And today, we're going to dive into lots of questions about election. Yesterday, around our country was election day, and there were lots of elections going on. But we're also going to talk about the national election for the presidency and the Electoral College. And there's so many questions. How does it work because of federalism? So Tom, you can already tell there's a million questions in our heads about this in general and trying to understand why it can be so difficult for people to answer really clearly, how do elections work? So lots of big questions, but also a lot of little questions as well. So as we pose those out, we can look through it and really dig into the system, and we'll dive into the Constitution. But do you want to say hi to everybody before we turn it over to the document and start analyzing it for information?
Sounds great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. What a great day to talk about national elections.
Yay, awesome. Okay, so first, Tom, we're going to start two parts of the Constitution. Well, not really parts, but two ways we're going to look at the Constitution. First, where are elections in the Constitution? And then what we're going to do next is where are voting rights in the Constitution? Because for so many of us, we see them as interconnected, and we need to understand how the process works, but also what is the principles in the Constitution around voting. And it's like a two-sided coin. So let's jump into where in the Constitution, it's like where's Waldo game, where in the Constitution do we find elections?
Sure. So, Curry, let's start with the original Constitution, the Constitution of 1787. If you look at the original Constitution, there are various parts that speak to voting. So it's sprinkled in a few different parts. First you would look at Article 1, Section 2. And so that part of the Constitution is giving us some of the qualifications for elections for the U.S. House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 3 turns to the Senate. And then Article 1, Section 4 is a really important part of the Constitution that tells us that the time, place, and manner of elections is given to the state legislatures, but there's a backstop where Congress can step in and regulate some of those things. And then finally, Article 2, Section 1 sets up the Electoral College, the way we select the president. We're going to spend a lot of time on that today, so I'll sort of bracket it. But if you're taking all of those sections together, I think there are two big takeaways that I would really emphasize. The first is that the original Constitution's leaving elections and voting largely to the states. So it really is, it's a story of federalism, a story of state power. And so because of this, we see a lot of variety on how states and localities run elections. It could be simple things like we see that different states elect state offices like governor, state legislators at different times, different years. We see mayors, county legislatures, town councils, school boards, just a great variety. Some years you may be voting for these things in one state, and some states may do it in a different year. And so there's great variety. It's a very complicated system in that sense. Also, we see varieties in different state laws in how elections are actually carried out. So how vote by mail works, or whether you can hand in your ballots at certain drop boxes ahead of time, or whether there's early voting in your state, and then different deadlines for registering to vote. These sorts of things, many of these things the Constitution is leaving primarily to the states. So it's a story of federalism. The other key point, though, Curry, is that we do within the original Constitution get a certain time, a certain rhythm to how different parts of the national government are going to be elected. And so with the U.S. House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. So every 2 years, the representatives are meant to return to the voters, return to the people, and state their case. It was meant to maintain sort of a close connection between the U.S. House of Representatives, those representatives, the people's house, and the voters themselves. The Senate, the senators serve, though, for 6 years. So it's a longer term with 1/3 of the Senate up every 2 years. So it's sort of a different life cycle there. And then finally, the president is elected every 4 years. So we see there the U.S. House of Representatives 2 years, the senators for 6 years, and the president there in between every 4 years. So that's just a bit about the original Constitution, Curry.
And it's kind of nice. It's kind of like, it feels like it's rotating, so you wouldn't lose like a whole shift of power at the same time. Now, the other thing that I just wanted to point out about what you said about the big takeaway about federalism is even with elections, so you might have a general state rule, but county by county, they can vary their rules around things like mail-in voting, things like drop-off sites. So again, why people, it finds it a little harder to hold on to understanding elections on the local level in a direct way. It just can be a little bit different because of the federalism and the localities saying what's best they believe for their people and their voters. Now, when we think of their voters, we think of different parts of the Constitution. So where in the Constitution does it spell out the right to vote in some capacity in the Constitution?
What we learn as we look at the rest of the Constitution is when we look at the 27 amendments to the Constitution, so many of them have to do with voting and elections. It's just something that we, the people, have returned to over and over again to reform our system in certain ways based on things that we've learned from the experience of trying to make America, this American Republic, work. So just to tick through them quickly, Curry, the 12th Amendment came very quickly, and it's a way in which we quickly revise how the Electoral College is going to work. With the 14th Amendment, we see a mechanism for penalizing states when they deny African American men access to the ballot box. But also the Supreme Court has used the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to protect voting in certain contexts. With the 15th Amendment, we banned racial discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment provides for the direct election of US senators. So under the original Constitution, US senators were selected by the state legislature. With the 17th Amendment, we have the system we have today where voters are directly electing US senators. The 19th Amendment bans sex discrimination in voting. The 23rd Amendment brings Washington, D.C.'s voters into the presidential election system, granting them 3 electors in the Electoral College. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in national elections. So this is attacking one of those Jim Crow forms of discrimination against African Americans. And finally, the 26th Amendment protects the voting rights for those 18 or older. The big themes here, Curry, if we're looking for big takeaways, one is that these amendments over time provide new protections to different groups in the context of voting, so as to race with the 15th Amendment, sex with the 19th Amendment, age with the 26th Amendment. But also some of these amendments, those amendments included, provide the national government with new powers to protect the voting rights of certain groups. And we've seen the national government, Congress, pass laws that have advanced voting rights for certain groups over time under those powers. Things like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which attacked various forms of discrimination at the ballot box. And the last thing is that we see certain amendments also giving voters new roles in elections, with the direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment, and then Washington, D.C. voters entering the Electoral College and the presidential vote with the 23rd.
Now, Tom, I know in a couple of weeks we're going to dive deep into Article 5 and how you changed the Constitution. But while we're on this conversation around voting and elections, so often what comes up in our classes is the question that students and teachers and adults ask themselves: should we keep the Electoral College? And they reference an amendment that might have to change it. But there's other ways to kind of affect the way the Electoral College has worked in the past. But before we dive into, should we keep it, should we cut it, what do we do about it, we probably really need to understand how it works, and then why did they put it in there in the first place? And so for that, Tom, let's start how stuff works on this. How does the Electoral College work, and what are all these numbers?
Sure. So the Electoral College, again, it's the system. It's written into Article 2 of the Constitution and the 12th Amendment. And what it does is it's our system for selecting a president. So the Electoral College is made up of 538 electors drawn from the various states and the District of Columbia. Article 2 of the Constitution tells us how we determine how many electors each state gets. Each state gets a number of electors that equal the number of representatives that state has in Congress. So here we see Pennsylvania. It has 17 members in the House of Representatives, 2 United States senators. That means Pennsylvania gets 19 electoral votes. We also know that from the 23rd Amendment that the Washington, D.C. gets 3 electoral votes. So the way to think about the Electoral College is, voters, they go to vote on election day for president. But in the end, they're not directly determining the outcome of the election. Their votes, that they're there at the left part, that's the voters writ large. They're voting for a slate of people that are electors that will then go to the Electoral College and technically vote for president. Now, the Electoral College, it's a real body. These electors actually meet at a time set by Congress in December and cast votes for president. If we're thinking of the Electoral College, it's not really, we wouldn't call it a deliberative body today. It's not as though these electors get together and really determine, really debate who should be president. Instead, it's a pretty mechanical process now the states have set up, leading from the voters' votes on election day to the slate of electors, which are determined in most cases by the political parties that are victorious in the presidential election in that state. And then those electors are determining who votes for president. If someone wins a majority in the electoral college, they become president, even if they didn't win the national popular vote. And then the last thing to note, Curry, is that the Constitution specifically sets up a system, again, that is giving a lot of power to the states to determine how electors are selected. So it's a story, once again, of federalism, of state power, and states over time have experimented with different ways of selecting electors. But today, most of the states, nearly every state, has sort of unified around one approach to selecting electors. So here we see it in California. It's a winner-take-all system where even if you won California by a single vote as a presidential candidate, you get all 54 of the electoral votes of California. And so that's a system that works in 48 states in the District of Columbia. There are 2 states that have their own rules, though, Nebraska and Maine, and both of them award electoral votes first by who wins each congressional district in the state, but then also awards an additional 2 electoral votes for whoever wins statewide. And so you can see here, although 48 states in the District of Columbia have come up with one system, we have 2 other states that do it a different way. And under the Constitution, states have a great deal of authority to choose how they're going to select electors over time.
And I think this is really interesting because we probably started noticing in the last few elections the map starting to have the stripes. And you're looking at states that are not just red or blue, but they're actually striped or they're different colors. So it was like a whole new wave of electoral map states started to come into wave. But there's other things that states have done around this. They've also used their power, their state power, to change how they apportion out these votes under ranked choice voting. So I know this is kind of the more advanced section. So can you just take one beat on ranked choice voting for the students?
Yeah, so from Maine, I believe, did it in the most recent presidential election. And so this is just the idea that when you're selecting your ballot, you're ranking so if there are multiple, more than 2 candidates or whatever, you can rank them sort of 1 to whatever based on your choice. And what this allows for is for instant runoffs, and eventually one person will then prevail as the winner. And so it avoids something where, if you're only allowed to vote for one person and there's, say, like 7 people running, someone might win with a very small percentage of the vote, even though they wouldn't be sort of they wouldn't win if you were ranked choice voting. I mean, so it's an innovation that we see states do, and it's again taking advantage of the fact that the system is giving states a great deal of power and discretion to define how elections are going to be conducted.
Perfect. And I wanted to kind of like lay those seeds in everybody's head. So as we're looking at that hypothetical, we can say it doesn't always have to be A or B. There's actually options in between, and we can experiment with what we think is a great way to have our voting in our system. But that then leads me back to, okay, why did they come up with this super complicated system to begin with? If you like it or you don't like it, it's still kind of tricky thinking about all the math and all the numbers that you do. What was the reasoning for this kind of system in place in the first place?
Yeah, so let's go back to the Constitutional Convention and think about the delegates' challenge there. And so obviously they're constructing this entirely new form of government. And in many ways, the presidency gave them the most trouble of all, because they really couldn't find an example in history or in their own experience of what exactly they were looking for in this new executive. So they looked to Europe and they saw powerful kings, and most of the delegates said, no, we don't want that. We had King George III, his royal officials. We said, no, we don't want that sort of a system. At the same time, they had state constitutions that they were living under before this new constitution, and they saw governors that seemed really, really weak and state legislatures that were really, really strong. And many delegates thought that didn't quite get the balance right either. We don't want an executive that's at least strong enough to challenge a state legislature if it's doing something that's unwise. And so they really were trying to struggle with, how do we strike this right balance? And so you have some delegates like Alexander Hamilton who said, maybe those kings, maybe they're not so terrible if they're elected, but at the very least, we want a single powerful president. And then you had others like Connecticut's Roger Sherman, who basically just wanted something like a prime minister, where it's just you have a president that's going to carry out whatever Congress wants to have done. So a very weak president and a very strong Congress. And so over time, the delegates are struggling with these big questions about how powerful the president should be, but they're also struggling over these four big issues that Curry has on the screen now. One, the primary one we're talking about, which is how are we going to elect a president? But for them, that's also connected to other big questions like how long should the president be able to serve? Should the president be able to run for re-election? And then the question of impeachment and removal, this question of what do we do if the president's abusing the power that we're giving to the president? And so over time, they struggled with all of these issues. And as to electing the president, the delegates really debated a few different options. And so just to tick through them very quickly, Curry, for many delegates, they wanted election of the president by Congress. And so you can understand, and many times, there were various times in the convention where the delegates voted and said, yeah, we're going to have the Congress select the president. For them, this seemed pretty obvious because they were thinking, okay, so who are the members of Congress going to be? They're going to be people like us, the best informed. In many ways, they would think, in many ways, they would think of themselves as the wisest people, the leaders in their community. And so they would be the most knowledgeable people selecting who the president's going to be. And so they thought, yes, so that makes sense. Congressional selection of president. Frankly, they already had in their state constitutions. Many states, most states selected their executives, their governors by state legislature. So they already saw the model in play in those state governments. And they thought maybe this could work at the national level. But this was subject to critiques, for instance, by Pennsylvania's Gouverneur Morris, who said, okay, you're right. Maybe we are wise, but I also know us. We can also sometimes we can do things that are self-interested. And so there's a concern when you get a small group of people together that it could become, quote, the work of intrigue, of cabal, of faction. There's a concern that we might, if we allow Congress to select the president, that the Congress then becomes that the president becomes dependent on Congress. And so this vision of wanting a president that's strong and independent and a check on Congress, it's really tough to get that if Congress is selecting the president. So that's sort of the two sides on the congressional vote. On the other side, there were a few delegates, most notably Pennsylvania's James Wilson, who called for the popular vote and thought that the president should be selected by popular vote. For Wilson, he said this is most consistent with the foundation of the American Constitution, which is popular sovereignty, ruled by we, the people. And so that this is the most natural way for Wilson of selecting a president. The critique here was a few different levels. There certainly were some delegates who were elitist. And so really just thought, the people really aren't up to this challenge, and we need sort of wise, virtuous national leaders to select it. And maybe it's Congress that does that or something like that. But so there is an elitist critique, but there's also a very practical critique. If we look at this moment, we're trying to create the largest republic in world history, and where most of the voters, from the perspective of many of the delegates, they're wise, they're good people, but they're people they stay in their towns. They rarely travel around the state, they rarely leave their state. And so over time, the concern was that the voters themselves aren't going to know who a lot of these candidates are. Sure, they may know members of their own community. Maybe they did big figures in their state, but that there aren't going to be enough national figures for them to be able to vote wisely for president. So maybe the first president, it's going to be George Washington. Everyone knows George Washington. Everyone loves George Washington. But after that, they were concerned that popular election really wouldn't work. And so in the end, they end up brokering the compromise known as the Electoral College. And for them, the Electoral College had the virtue of creating some independence for the president. So the president's going to be selected by an independent body, this Electoral College, that's going to basically be created on election day and then dissolved after they vote. And so it's an independent source of political authority for the president. And it's not to say there weren't critiques of this. So some delegates were concerned that how is this Electoral College really going to work? Are people going to be able to travel to do these votes? Is this going to cost a lot of money? I mean, this may seem silly to us today, but actually, putting a national infrastructure like this in place on a blank slate was not an easy thing for them to think. The other was that some delegates wondered who exactly is going to serve in this Electoral College. We're going to be in Congress, we're going to be in government. Who's going to be left over to be in the Electoral College? So there were concerns that they wouldn't end up having figures in the Electoral College that were, quote, of even the second or even the third grade, as one of the delegates said.
So obnoxious. And I also remind people, there's just a lot less people. There's a lot less people during this time in America, and you have you wrap your head around this time period and how few people. So when they're saying these things, it's also because they realize the amount of people in these communities and that are able to travel, that can do all these things and have what they believe are the right skills for the job. So it is a real, I think it's 1792. Philadelphia is the largest city in the New World, and it has 52,000 inhabitants. That's it.
Yeah, no, and Curry, so in the end, the Electoral College gives a little bit to each of these sides. For James Wilson, he looks at it and says, this is probably the closest I'm going to get to a popular vote. And then over time, for Wilson, his prediction is what we're going to do with the Electoral College. We're going to place this decision in the hands of the states. We're going to give the states a lot of power. And what's going to happen over time is that as states give more popular input to the voters, other states will follow. And so federalism is going to lead into the direction of more popular input into the presidential election process. And you know what? Wilson was right about that. The flip side was for those who supported the congressional election, under the Constitution, if no candidate gets a majority in the Electoral College, the election then is thrown into the House of Representatives with the representatives voting by state. And so these delegates thought, after Washington, very, very few figures are going to have the national reputations necessary to get a majority in the Electoral College. So we're going to get vote by Congress anyway. So Electoral College being another means of resulting in election by Congress. George Mason predicted 19 times out of 20 presidential elections are going to go into the House of Representatives. Of course, they were wrong, but they had no way to know that that was true. That could seem like a totally sensible prediction until we see how elections are actually going to play out in the United States under this Constitution. They were doing something new.
Yeah, experimenting means you sometimes have really big flops. And so they started off really strong with Washington. And then they go into kind of what I refer to as the founding era soap opera, drama with the frenemies in front of you. So tell us the story about the election of 1788 and 1792.
So the thing to remember about the original Constitution is the electors for the Electoral College don't vote for one person, they vote for two. So they're voting for two people. Whoever receives the most number of votes, a majority of the votes in the Electoral College becomes president, but whoever's in second place becomes vice president. And what the framers didn't anticipate was that we were going to have political parties. They feared political parties. They really didn't want us to have them. They thought that would lead to partisanship, what they would have called factionalism, and they really didn't build the system with political parties in mind. So you're right, Curry. The first two elections were fine. George Washington's running. He gets the unanimous vote of the electors. Everything goes smoothly. Furthermore, John Adams gets a lot of votes, so he finishes in second place, becomes vice president. Fine. 1788, 1792. Everything without a hitch. But 1796, we have a showdown between two of the most famous founders, John Adams, the sitting vice president, and Thomas Jefferson, the former Secretary of State. And John Adams wins this race. But what we see is already we see the emergence of early political parties. John Adams, he's affiliated with the Federalists, Thomas Jefferson with the Democratic Republicans. And so John Adams wins the Electoral College. He becomes the president. But but Jefferson finishes so close to him that he actually finishes in second place, not a Federalist, doesn't finish in second place in the Electoral College. Thomas Jefferson does. So under this original system, John Adams becomes president, and his political opponent, his political rival, the political figure in the other party, Thomas Jefferson, becomes his vice president. And so picture in our own time, Donald Trump as president, Hillary Clinton as vice president, or Joe Biden as president and Donald Trump as vice president. You can imagine this was a pretty awkward situation for all involved in 1796. It's not a great way necessarily to structure the national administration. So that's one problem, but we see an even bigger one emerge in the election of 1800. We see a rematch between Adams and Jefferson. This time Jefferson wins. He wins the Electoral College, but he runs into a problem. He and his running mate, Aaron Burr, both the same party, received the same number of votes in the Electoral College, 73. And so the election goes into the House of Representatives. Everyone knows Thomas Jefferson's supposed to be the president. Aaron Burr is supposed to be the vice president. But Aaron Burr says, there's a system in place here. There's a formal system. I'm going to go for the presidency. Let's see what happens. And who's selecting the president in this situation? It's the House of Representatives, controlled by the Federalists who just lost the election. And so it's the political rivals of Jefferson and Burr deciding between them which of them will become president. And so it's a long process in the House of Representatives that lasts 6 days. There's over 30 ballots. There's great tension as to who the House of Representatives is going to select. But we have Jeffersonian governors in Pennsylvania and Virginia threatening to raise their state militias and march on Washington and make sure that Jefferson becomes president. They think he's the legitimate figure that should be president. And in the end, cooler heads prevail. Federalists outside of Congress, key ones like Alexander Hamilton, assess the situation and think, you know what? I don't like Thomas Jefferson. He's my political rival in many ways, but he's the lesser of two evils here. And so they convince some of their Federalist allies in the House of Representatives, vote for Jefferson. Jefferson becomes president. This sets an important precedent in certain ways, where we have a peaceful transition of power between a sitting president of one party and his political rival in another party. But the other legacy of the election of 1800 is we need to fix this electoral college system. We need to make it better match the reality that we now have political parties. And so very quickly thereafter, we moved to both draft and ratify the 12th Amendment. This is the system all the way up until today that we have. And the key change that it makes is now the electors in the Electoral College, they're still going to have two votes. One vote is specifically for president, and one vote is specifically for vice president. And so what they're really trying to do is eliminate the Jefferson Burr situation. And so they have.
Awesome. And just the thought of the loser getting the vice president seat and how that would be completely an unfunctional system in the White House. So really kind of crazy to think about that being applied today. We have about 5 more minutes left, and it's Woodland High asked a question about faithless electors cases. And I know there's actually a lot of cases that have to do with this. So Tom, can you lay out what is a faithless elector? What is kind of the setup around that? And then tell us about some of the cases that lead up to these 2 recent cases.
Yeah, the Supreme Court has not decided many cases on the Electoral College, but they actually decided a pair last year: Schiapolo versus State of Washington, Colorado versus Department of State. And this had to do with the issue of faithless electors. This is the idea that you have electors in the Electoral College, those people in the middle group, and under state law, they actually pledge their support for a particular presidential candidate when they become electors. And faithless electors are people that decide, we took this pledge, but we're going to vote for someone else instead. And so what happened in these cases is these were Democratic electors who were pledged to support Hillary Clinton in the election of 2016, but they wanted to vote for someone else. And so they cast their vote for someone else. One of the states would then punish those faithless electors $1,000 fine for voting for someone other than who they pledged. The other state actually simply threw out the electoral vote of the person who violated their pledge and put in place an alternate. And so these cases raise the question of, can the states do that? Do they have the power to do that? And the Supreme Court ultimately, in a unanimous decision, said that yes, they did. And what they did was they looked really at a couple of different sources of authority. One of the key sources of authority was the Supreme Court itself. So the Supreme Court has 2 really big cases on the Electoral College. One is called McPherson versus Blacker, which was in the late 1800s. And what happened was Michigan actually set up a system very much what we talked about Maine and Nebraska having today, distributing their electoral votes by congressional district. People challenged this, and the Supreme Court upheld the Michigan law. They said Michigan can do this. The Supreme Court effectively said, look and read Article 2 of the Constitution. It's granting broad authority to the states to select electors as they'd like. So we're going to defer to them in this case. This is totally fine. Different states can approach their electors in different ways. So that makes McPherson versus Blacker really broad authority for the states. And then fast forward to 1952 in a case called Ray v. Blair. And what Alabama sets up is a system where they want to curb the discretion of the electors once they're selected. So they say, if you want to be an elector in the Electoral College, you have to pledge your support for a particular presidential candidate ahead of time. And so one of the people who wanted to be an elector challenged this law, said it was unconstitutional, said, as an elector, I have independence to select whoever I want. That's what the Electoral College is all about. It's all about, elector means having discretion. I'm like a US senator. I'm like a US member of the US House of Representatives. They may determine how I can be selected ahead of time, but once I'm an elector, I have the constitutional duty to vote my conscience. And so that's the challenge. The Supreme Court said no. They sided with Alabama and they said, once again, the Constitution grants broad authority to the states. The states can curb elector discretion. They can force electors to pledge their support for a particular candidate. And then those 2 cases we mentioned at the beginning, Schiapolo and the Colorado case, asked the follow-up question, okay, you can have a pledge, but can you actually punish the elector if they violate that pledge? And the Supreme Court said yes. It said both because of those decisions I just talked about, McPherson versus Blacker and Ray v. Blair, but an opinion by Justice Elena Kagan for a unanimous Supreme Court. What she effectively says is just look at how states have also carried out their responsibilities of carrying out the Electoral College system over time. What do we learn from that experience, from that historical practice? It's that over time, states have determined that there needs to be a pretty direct popular link between what the voters do on election day and how the electors vote in the presidential race, and that states have broad authority to ensure that there's real, genuine popular input and a direct connection between what the voters say and who ends up getting the electoral votes in each individual state.
Awesome, Tom. That was really helpful. And something I wanted to clarify, and I don't know if I have my head fully wrapped around this, so help me out here. We vote for and pick electors during part of the voting process. It's not typically, on election day for a president. It's typically before it. But is there almost like two groups or multiple groups, and one group of electors if, say the Republican candidate wins, one group of electors if the Democratic candidate wins, and if they win or take the state or whatever, that group goes? Is that how it works, that they're set up separately and different people will go depending on who wins?
Yes, it's determined by state law. So states have discretion in how they do this. Generally speaking, what happens, it's a state law says each party comes up with its slate of electors. And then the voters vote on election day, and whichever party's candidate wins, that party then determines its slate of electors that gets sent to the Electoral College.
Got it. Okay, just to clarify, because sometimes you think it's just a general person going, and they're going to be like almost like they're a messenger carrying it, but they're people that are picked by their own parties. So it seems like realistically, you would have less of a chance of somebody, going to a different vote or going to the other side. Has this happened in any cases before where there was like a really good reason for it, not just because they thought they had a better answer?
Yeah, so there's been 157 faithless electors in history, which is fewer than 1% of all electoral votes cast. Justice Kagan says this in her opinion in Schiaffolo. And there's a variety of reasons why we've had faithless electors. I think it's 63 of the electors were because candidate Horace Greeley, who was a major party candidate for the Liberal Republican ticket in 1872, died. So the candidate died between election day and whenever the Electoral College was going to vote, and so they just wound up voting for someone differently. There also were situations where an elector from the District of Columbia, in protest for not having a congressional vote, decided to abstain. We've even had, I think it was the election of 2004, where someone just accidentally, they were supposed to vote for John Kerry, the Democratic candidate, and instead they wrote in John Edwards as vice president in the wrong place. And so John Edwards has a random electoral vote in the 2004 election. But I love this one example, Curry, just to give you an idea of how early this idea of curbing elective discretion came. It's from the election of 1796. It's that election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. There's an elector, Samuel Miles. He's a Federalist from Pennsylvania. He's pledged himself to John Adams, but he decides to vote for Thomas Jefferson. And we have this great passage from an angry voter in the Pennsylvania Gazette at the time, where the voter's so mad that this faithless elector didn't vote for who they said. And they said, "What, do I choose Samuel Miles to determine for me whether John Adams or Thomas Jefferson should be president? No, I choose him to act, not to think." And so there's this idea already that voters really think they're the ones that are supposed to have the say. And broadly speaking, Curry, again, it goes back to that prediction by Pennsylvania's James Wilson at the Constitutional Convention. If we look at how states have implemented the Electoral College over time, they started having popular input in electors from the very beginning, from the election of Washington, and very quickly moved to a process that really tried to set in place a system that was going to allow for the voters' votes translated in a single state to then the electoral votes that are determined for that state on election day.
Awesome. And I love that was so early. And it's just like, do what they tell you. Don't make up your own mind around this. Go send my message in. And then it really lands us, and I know we have to wrap up, it really lands us with a question that we're all discussing and debating, the pros and cons of the Electoral College, and saying, should we keep the Electoral College? Should we edit the Electoral College? Should we change it? Should we abolish it? So I know we're a little over time, but give us the 2-minute wrap up of the pros and cons of the Electoral College. Why would somebody say, thinking about the faithless electors are just taking our votes and moving them over? Somebody could easily say, well, why don't we just do it ourselves and have a direct vote? But somebody else would say, no, there's a reason for this system, and it actually makes it a better system. So can you kind of lay out for the pros and cons for us?
Yeah, so the supporters of the Electoral College, many of their arguments extend all the way back to what we saw at the Constitutional Convention and people who have defended the Electoral College since. And that's, in part, it preserves a role for federalism in our presidential elections. The Constitution in so many different ways grants broad authority to the states to experiment in different ways with different systems. And so the Electoral College is seen of a piece with that. The other is that for supporters of the Electoral College, they look at the system and say, there's no single way to ensure that presidents get nationwide support from a variety of states and variety of types of voters. But the Electoral College, by honoring federalism in the variety of the states, is one way to sort of leverage that to ensure sort of broad presidential support, again, across a variety of states and types of voters. And so that's what the supporters of the Electoral College say. The critics counter that, one, the Electoral College, it's inconsistent with some of the other trends we've seen in American history and elections, which have moved in the direction of popular input, that they sort of criticize the idea that we do have elections in which the person who won the national popular vote did not become president, that there's a different winner of the national popular vote and the Electoral College, and they see this as inconsistent with the general American commitment to democracy that they've seen reaffirmed over time. And the last thing that they would say is that, the danger of the Electoral College is that we have, it breaks America into states that have competitive elections and that don't. And so that presidential campaigns end up being concentrated in a very small number of states that are actually competitive, and many of the other states are largely ignored. And so you can see there's strong arguments that sound in different principles of American constitutionalism among both the supporters and critics. And I mean, the one thing to remember about the Constitution is that the founding generation put in place Article 5, which is the process for amending the Constitution, with the idea that over time we'll learn from experience and either reaffirm and say we like the way we've done it, and so that there's wisdom in the system as it exists, but there's a mechanism in place that if we want to change it, we can continue to debate it. And if we come to some sort of broad consensus that there's something that works better, we can use Article 5 to amend the Constitution. The last part, Curry, is that also the Electoral College itself, by leveraging federalism, by giving states broad discretion, also does allow for different states to experiment in different ways in how they're going to conduct their presidential elections and how they're going to select electors. So even the system itself builds in the possibility of experimentation, of learning from experience, and for states to learn from one another.
And I love that. And I always love the idea of experimentation, testing new things, and then coming to, when we're ready, a commitment to say, this is the next direction we're going to take, or we're going to keep the way we have it because we like this ability to be flexible across the country. Tom, thank you so much. That was a lot to go through. And I know we put too much on your plate, not just the Electoral College and the presidency, but all national elections going on this year. But it's really helpful for all of us to dive into all parts of the Constitution and dig into it even more. And you pointed this out earlier. And next week, we're going to dive really deep into voting rights. So see you next week on that front. We've got a lot of great guests. I think Michael Morley is this Friday to come in and talk about elections. And then next Friday is Jamel Bowie talking about voting rights. So what a great Friday lineup too. It's a really fun class. Tom, thank you so much. And students, I want you all to have a great day. Warren and Colin, thank you in the chat as well as being support systems.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Colin.